Welcome everyone to the next edition of the World Federation of Engineering Organisations Young Engineers Future Leaders webinar series, Engineering the Future. Today's topic is Young Engineers equal board members. One of the biggest challenges facing young engineers today is having a seat at the table and understanding how organisations and companies operate. This discussion today will provide young engineers insights and a starting point to understanding company structure, and in particular the role of the board and how young engineers can get involved. So the session will run for approximately an hour with a Q&A session facilitated myself with our 4 amazing speakers today. And there'll be a chance to answer any questions that you do have. So as a starting point, I guess I should introduce myself. My name's Nicole Brown and I'm a structural engineer based in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm the current Australian delegate on the Young Engineers Future Leaders Committee. So welcome everybody to the discussion today. As I mentioned, there is an opportunity to ask questions, so please have a look in the chat box for the Google Drive link and you'll be able to fill out your questions there. So to get to the main part of our session, introducing our amazing 4 speakers who all come from very diverse and unique backgrounds. So instead of me keeping on talking, I'm going to ask each of them to give a brief overview of themselves. So Mavis, can we start with you?
Thank you very much, Nicole. Such a pleasure to be here this morning and welcome to all the participants this morning. My name is Mavis Braga Elias. I hail from a beautiful country in Southern Africa called Namibia, and I am presently a Chevening Scholar studying at the University of Sussex doing my MA in Globalization, Business and Development. I am a civil engineer by qualification, a development specialist by profession, and I am the founder of a nonprofit organization called the EM Love Foundation. Its focus primarily is on eradicating, or rather playing a role in eradicating poverty on the ground in Namibia. In addition to that, I have served as a founding member of the One Economy Foundation, which is also a nonprofit organization within my home country, led by the First Lady of Namibia, Madam Monica Gengwas. And in essence, that is my background in as far as sitting on a board, and it's such a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mavis. And we'll hand over to you, Avi.
Hello, everybody. My name is Avi Menon. I'm co-founder and partner at a civil engineering company called Koleko. We have offices in South Africa, Mozambique, and Uganda. I've served as the chairperson of the Young Members Panel of SAICI. SAICI is a voluntary civil engineering organization that serves over 11,000 members. And I've been involved in SAICI since 2013. And I've served on their executive board for about 2.5 years. I currently serve on their council. We can get into the details of what is executive board and council, but yeah, that's my background. So I serve on the company's board and also on the nonprofit board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi. And Stacey, over to you.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So I am by qualification an engineer of geotechnical or geological, as it was called, was the course that I did. And I sort of steered into an environmental area of practice, I suppose. So I worked in the mining industry. So I am currently now in Melbourne, in Victoria, in Australia. And so this is where I actually did my studies. I then went across to Western Australia to a place called Kalgoorlie, if any of you have heard of it. It's an outback mining town in Australia, and it's very characteristic and quite an interesting place to work. But I spent 4 years there working in open pits and underground in both geotechnical and environmental roles. I then moved back home to Victoria, and I actually had quite a change in my career and worked in local government. And then I ended up actually getting involved with boards not long after that. And I got involved in local community committees. I also got involved with what we call government or statutory authorities. And I had the fortunate opportunity of being able to be involved with a ski resort. So that was pretty cool. But also to work with the planning and management of Victoria's coastline. So quite diverse, but mainly in land management. I then went on to found more recently a business called Board Presence, and I help boards and directors, committees and aspiring directors as well to basically do what they can do best in terms of bringing themselves to the boardroom and make the decisions that are needed. So being able to work together collectively, but also be able to be the best that you can be as an individual.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Definitely a wealth of experience there. And last but not least, Ted.
Hi, yeah, my name is Ted. I'm a co-founder of a company called Evercomm Singapore. Obviously, we're based in Singapore. And what we do is more on the energy management side for the governments and for the industrial clients. For my experience, I'm actually a science policy focal point for the UN MGCY, Major Group for Children and Youth. I'm also a consultant for UNDP. And in terms of experience on the board side, recently I also just joined the ITU Generation Connects board. So the idea of the Generation Connect is how ITU can better engage young people, specifically in the policy spaces. So they asked a few of us to sit on the board to see how can we help that make happen so that from a policy side, they can get more young people's ideas into the implementation of their overall strategy and etc.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, we have an amazing group of panelists here. So I'll jump straight into the questions. So the first one, let's start at the beginning. What does it mean, or what does being on a, and based on your experience, what has been your experience on different types of boards? And I'll go to Stacey first off.
So as I said before, I've been involved in a range of different organisations. My first board role was actually, I was probably about 15 years younger than everybody else around the table. They were all directors and CEOs of local government or councils within Victoria. And I managed to get involved because the number of nominations actually equaled the number of applicants. So I think if there had been more directors and CEOs who put their hand up, I may not have got a gig, but the fact that I did meant that I got involved. So it was about taking a bit of a pot shot. But also I was there with my engineering hat on, and there weren't many other engineers. And so, you know, being young and being there, at least I had something that I could sort of really exercise my expertise. But otherwise, what I did was sort of take a little bit of an observation role and sort of got to learn the ropes, so to speak, purely because I felt, you know, quite intimidated being a lot younger than most of the others in the room and a lot less experienced.
I think we've had a few of the panelists nodding along and can definitely agree with that sentiment. And when we're talking about boards, we've talked about statutory boards and what you were originally involved in. But Avi, you mentioned being a part of a not-for-profit board with the SAICE. So as the chair of that group, what was your experience in the not-for-profit board space?
It was actually quite an interesting experience. The reason being, so prior to that, I've served on the board of a for-profit company, and the objective, the directives, your mandate is completely different as compared to a nonprofit. So nonprofit, the objective is to serve the paying members. So like I said, we have about 11,000 paying members, and the aim of the organization is to promote civil engineering as a profession, as an industry. You help engineers, help them get trained. So the mandate was completely different. So that was quite an interesting experience to, you know, wear a different sort of a hat, see it from a different light, and to help out and I was specifically involved with promoting young engineers in South Africa. So it was a completely different perspective, and it was a good learning experience.
So when you say, just expanding on that a little bit, the not-for-profit space was for the members and everything you do was to increase the value of their membership. What was your experience on the other side of it in the for-profit space? What was the purpose of that board?
For profit, it boils down to what is your top line, what is your bottom line, how can you maximize profit, essentially without, cutting corners or without compromising the brand and the values of the brand. Obviously that has to be upheld, but it's predominantly at the end of the day, how much profit are you making? What our forecast looks like, what are our sales forecasts for the next quarter, for the next year, how can we maximize it? Are there new ventures that we need to get into or new markets that we need to get into? What services can we increase? Who do we partner with? So it's a completely different ballgame.
Thank you for clarifying. And I guess another side of things, Ted, from your experience in the policy space, how does a board differ when we're talking about policy?
No, I really enjoy the earlier conversation. I think when it comes to the policy board, I actually want to participate, and I actually look forward to the board meeting. When it's my own board meeting, being chased by investor, all these, I'm not so looking forward to those board meetings. But on the policy space with the ITUs, it's a lot more interesting. And then everyone coming there, it's all about, what more can we do, right? Who else should we involve? It's more on the ideation side rather than the bottom line execution side. So definitely from an experience perspective, personally, I would like the policy sides of boards much more interesting and much more strategy driven than the corporate side, which is much more bottom line driven and etc.
Thank you. And I guess adding on to that conversation, Mavis,
Nicole,
you were actually, oh yes, Avi?
If I can interrupt you,
Sure.
I agree with when we have our for-profit meetings, it's usually our neck is on the line quite a lot. And on the non-profit side, it's really, how can we make things better? It's more of creative ways because you're not confined by, you're not trying to make profit at the end of the day. So your resources are a bit more flexible.
It's the difference between the accountability side of things and the creativity and seeing what the purpose is, depending on the board that you're associated with. So I guess when we're trying to determine what the board's role will actually be, Mavis, you were the inaugural chair of a board of directors. How was that experience?
I think I have been fortunate in that I sort of was a founding member of my nonprofit organization. But in addition to that, I was also a founding board member of the One Economy Foundation. And in both instances, the process, I would assume, is incredibly different to already established organization in that you have to sort of sit in the process of determining the governance framework from the very beginning, which means that there's a lot of ensuring that you actually adhere to the policies that are put in place for either registration or ensuring that you actually find yourself on the right side of the law. I particularly enjoyed that process because it allowed the formulation of the values of the organization looking forward. It's sort of putting you in a position where you can decipher and determine how exactly will this organization run, what is it that it would like to focus on, what are the core principles, and really just establishing an entire charter of how this organization will run. And in as much as the task can be very daunting, it's also a very creative process, and I think it allows for a lot of the founding members to be able to sort of give their perspective in what are the things that this organization should focus on. And in the space of the One Economy Foundation, it's a sort of a national body because it serves the Namibian people at sort of top level. And in that, it allows you to actually be able to pinpoint what are the things that need to be established and sort of worked on in the space, and especially in a country setting. So really, it's a very extensive process, but one that if you have a very strong governance at the very beginning of inception, it means that going forward, this organization will be run with the utmost efficiency and as well as ensuring that it adheres to the governance framework. So to answer your question, it's an extensive process for starters, but it's also a very fun and creative process.
And I guess just an additional question, when you're founding the board, what sort of composition of members do you actually look for? Sort of who makes up that inaugural board? Is there specific skill sets that you look for?
I think that's an excellent question. And the reason I say it's an excellent question is because with the One Economy Foundation, it had such a unique structure. In most instances, it's usually looking at different sort of skill sets that the different members can come with. But the One Economy Foundation board was unique in that it not only looked at skill set, but it also looked at representation, in that it wanted to ensure that the people that the board was going to serve, in that the Namibian people, the marginalized, underrepresented, actually had a voice at the board. So in my instance, the reason as to why I was sitting on this board is because I was representing the youth voice, in that they wanted to ensure that they had the representation of the youth, they had the representation of the under-marginalized. We had a man by the name Festus Muunga, who also sat on the board. And this is a man who, with extreme many different talents, was unable to sort of penetrate the industry because of having been marginalized and having grown up underprivileged. And in addition to that, we had a chartered accountant, we had somebody from the financial sector, and just even the microfinance sector, and just different bodies and people, because representation on the board is equally as important as the skill set. And that unique combination is what I think really was beautiful about the One Economy Foundation board. So to answer your question, it's primarily about skill set, because these different people have to come forth and sort of give a voice to the different expertise that they come with. But in addition to that, representation is equally as important.
Can I add to that?
Yes, of course.
Just to add to that, because I think it brought up a very interesting point, again, between the two different boards. Exactly for the board related to ITU, it's about diversity and stuff. But on the private corporate side, the boards are relatively one dimension, because at the end of the day, the board is there to make sure that as a company, that when we go public or when we go list, they want to see a certain profile. So there's actually not much diversity here compared to usually, the other side of the boards.
Is that something you find, Stacey, when you're supporting boards through the board presence company that you're at?
Yeah, I think what it is, Nicole, I think picking up on, excuse me, what Ted and Mavis was sort of alluding to, is that depending on the purpose of boards, and I'm going to jump to take this opportunity to explain the different types of boards that do exist, because I think that's something that people just tend to, when they think about boards, they think about publicly listed or on the stock exchange or big multinational companies. And the reality is, and what we're talking about, is that there are different types of boards. So I talked about before about community committees. So a lot of the incorporated organisations are not-for-profits. And then obviously when you've got perhaps a new organisation, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, it's going to obviously be a little bit different, the skill set that's required at that point versus later on down the track. But there's government authorities that are obviously operating at cost generally, or revenue based, generally not for profit. And for the purpose by which each of these organisations exist is what dictates what you need on your board. And then at whatever particular point in time, whether they're startup, scaling up, more mature, or even if they start to drop down the other side and perhaps stop operating, or if they've got to sort of reinvent themselves, then the skills that you need on your board at any particular point in time is going to be different. So I think just to expand a little bit more, Nicole, so there's a lot of boards which are legal boards. And so they do probably what you're talking about, Ted, in terms of they need to fulfill all their legal requirements, compliance. There's investors that want to make sure there's returns, so there's some obligations there. But then there's also organisations which have, sometimes on those boards you might just have a decision-making role or a strategic role. But then there's other ones which are legal, but they also, you might have your hands-on as well. You might be a committee of management where you have both the legal responsibilities, but you also have the hands-on role of actually doing the work. And then sometimes you're more perhaps just an advisor, an advisory group that recommends to a board who then makes the final decision. So I think it's really important just to understand all those differences. And as Mavis said too, there's some that are representative, but then there's others that are skill-based. So those different appointment processes can vary. And I always say it really varies across all types of organisations. And even when there's organisations in the same sort of realm, they've probably got different processes and they might have a different number of board members, etc. So it's hard to sort of take one model and apply it to another.
Very true, Mavis. You just need to unmute yourself. Oh, there we go.
I love that Stacey actually led with even just explaining what different types of boards exist, because at the end of the day, that is a very important element and foundation for this conversation. In addition to that, I realized that when you did ask me who should be on the board, I realized that the people who sit on the board, you've got the board of directors, right? They can either be executive or non-executive. And in most cases, the chairperson will probably be an executive chairperson or whichever. But in addition to that, in a boardroom, you've got the top level management who sit in and they generally do the feedback to the board. And then you've got the sort of executive directors as well, who could be board members. So it can be a mixture of different dynamics that come to play to that seating, in that directors generally could also be shareholders in the profit space. And then they could also be on the executive side, in that they actually have day-to-day operations. They are involved in that, but also are involved in the decision-making process at board level. And so it's also just understanding those different dynamics, and that sometimes somebody could sit as a board member and then also in an executive committee for one or the other reason, which is one of the things that I've done. So just understanding that you don't necessarily only find yourself seated at a board table because you're a board member. You could be seated there to feed back to the board as sort of top level management. And I would assume that in this room, we probably have people from that type of background.
No, thank you so much for elaborating on that. And as you say, and this is one of the reasons that I propose this topic today, is that boards are extremely complex things, and they're an infinite number of compositions of a board, skill sets required, types of boards. And because of these complexities, it can be quite daunting. So I guess we'll take it back a step, understanding that there are a lot of different types of boards out there. Are there certain skills that people should, I guess, look to develop, or experiences that a board would bring you, and why you should actually join a board in the first place? So I might just ask Avi first off, and why you got involved in your boards at the start.
Nicole, my involvement with the executive board of Stacey, it wasn't something planned. I never said I want to be on a board and work towards it. I think it just happened to come by. In terms of skill set, I think engineering doesn't really teach you the softer side of things, the legal, the financial, all those aspects, the risk management side of things. So I think that was something that I had to quickly learn and understand, interacting with some of the board members. The mandate being, how do we promote civil engineering in South Africa as a profession? And it was interesting to see how the board went about doing that. And when there were, for example, I'd like to quote a story where it's a true story, where a couple of years ago, one of the senior directors in the organization published an article that was quite controversial, and a lot of the members threatened to withdraw their membership from the organization. And as a board, we had to call in for an emergency meeting, figure out now what to do. How do we mitigate this risk? We had to appoint a PR company or public relations company to see how do we, stop this frenzy that's happening on Twitter and on social media. So all these are, it wasn't something that we were prepared for, but for me, it was a good learning experience to see how the board members managed it. What are the actions that we took, and once the issue was resolved, then the question was, how do we prevent such events happening in the future? What steps or procedures do we put in place? So that was, again, an interesting sort of experience to go through that. And it was quite an experience, and it was a short period of 3 months or 4 months, but it was quite intense. It was something that I wasn't prepared for, and it was what I took away from it is, there were a lot of things that I took away from it. And on the profit side, if my company goes through something like this in future, then at least I'm sort of prepared. I know the resources, I know what needs to be done, or at least I know that there were these board members who served on Stacey's board who I can reach out to and ask for help or ask for guidance.
And that's such a good point, because the skills are transferable amongst the different boards, and there's certain things that you will learn being in that board space that you may not have the opportunity. So I guess building on that topic, Stacey, you work with a lot of people in supporting them in starting their board journey. And I know you're just about to launch a new leadership program around getting involved in boards. So from your experience, why do people join boards, and what sort of skills should they look to develop before they start their journey or at the start of their journey?
So that is the biggest question, Nicole, that I first ask people is why? Why do you want to get on a board? Because I think for a lot of people, it's a very prestigious sort of thing. They associate it with a lot of power and with a lot of, a great title or something to be able to say, I'm on the board of. But in actual fact, they are the last reasons that you want to hear. I wait to hear the words of, I want to contribute, I want to make a difference, I want to be able to use my skills or offer what I've got. And the biggest thing that I also say to people is, you take your whole self into the boardroom. You don't just take the engineer, or you don't just take the accountant. You take your whole self. So all of your skills, so your professional skills, your knowledge, your insights, your personal insights. So you may even have experienced a family tragedy or something that may have given you a certain experience that not many people get. And that experience can actually help with some insightful decision making for a board who might be working in the social or community development space, for example. So yes, there are some minimum sort of requirements in terms of being able to understand what accounts are or the financials, understanding that you do have some legal obligations. So as I said before, not all committees, for example, perhaps like the young leaders, that you guys are not a legal entity yourself. You're a part of the WFEO. So yet you guys are obviously working together for a purpose. So it's just really important to understand that, okay, if you're going to step into a board with some responsibilities, that you do need to have a bit of nous, certainly be able to ask lots of questions. But then there's all those things like being able to listen, being able to, respect other people's views, understand where people come from, being able to express your views properly. And if there's sort of need to look at sort of training on bits and pieces, then, you can work on that. But it's really important to do that self-reflection and go through a self-awareness process. Because then what you can do too is that you understand who you are, what you've got to offer, your value proposition. You understand what your pitch is to somebody for getting involved with the board, because how do your skills benefit their organisation? Do you fill a gap in their skills mix, for example? So being able to then formulate that into something like a board CV and any other documentation you need, and be able to have those subsequent conversations is really important.
I couldn't agree more, Stacey, and understanding why you're a part of it. And personally, the reason I get involved in committees is because I want to help, and I want to be able to increase my understanding and my awareness of the way the world operates. And the Young Engineers Future Leaders Committee, as you mentioned, is not a legal entity, but we are a collection of young engineers from all across the world, and it provides me the opportunity to learn more about different countries, having Ted in Singapore, Mavis from Namibia, but currently based in England, and Avi in South Africa. Just the opportunity to connect with people and learn and develop is an incredible experience.
And
So,
I think what it does,
yeah.
Sorry, Nicole, I was just going to pick up and say, I think it's a really important thing to understand too when we talk about different types of boards and skills and development, that there is a pathway. Sometimes you don't have to be thinking about some of the risks that Avi's talked about in terms of PR crises and things like that. So being on a board doesn't mean you have to dive straight into that sort of environment, because I think that'd turn off some people. But what you can do is obviously, a little bit like you, Nicole, you've started somewhere with a committee, then maybe, your next appointment might be something with a bit of legal responsibility, but nothing too big, like something that's about to be listed. Obviously, you'll be matched up in your journey to what suits your skills, but to understand that it is a journey as well. And I've actually just recently become a chair for a startup organisation. So I've previously turned down a chair role because I wasn't happy with that organisation, with what they were looking for, and being able to provide satisfactory financials. They didn't tick my box. So you've got to also make sure it's the right opportunity for you.
Yeah, and it's about matching your skill set and interest to the opportunity.
Yeah.
So I guess asking the big question for those on there, I'll come back to yourself, Avi, but starting with, I guess, we've talked about the different types of boards, we've talked about why you should join one, but asking the big question for those listening today, why should young people look for board opportunities and get involved? And I'll start with you, Mavis.
Thank you, Nicole. I think to just touch on what Stacey mentioned is that there are such fundamental questions to ask yourself in that. What is your objective? Is it sort of title grabbing? Is it just trying to climb up the corporate ladder? Because I think at the end of the day, to sit on a board with such a large responsibility of steering an organization to its objectives and core values is such a fundamental part of the organization, because some of the core decisions are made at board level, and you'd have to actually check in with yourself and ask yourself what your intentions are. But I also wanted to touch on one of those things before, just talking about why young people should get involved. And it's that, how do you get your foot into the door? Because at the end of the day, you could actually have all these intentions, right? And you could know exactly what your objective and core reason for actually entering this space is about, but how do you get your foot into the door? And I just wanted to add on to what Stacey was talking about. And I think at the end of the day, getting yourself into that door is all about networking. And really just being able to understand that sometimes you have to get yourself to speak to the right people to understand what opportunities exist. But not only should you network, but you actually have to intentionally make those applications, because some board positions are advertised, and you actually have to fill in an application. So setting that intention and then looking for the opportunity is also a part of the process. But back to your question, Nicole, in relation to why should young people actually serve on boards or even look to get into the board space, is because of representation. Some of the issues and things that young people would like to have done, especially at high level decision-making spaces, is that in order for you to see the change that you want to see, particularly for your age group and especially for young people and younger, is that you want to get yourself in a position where your voice can be represented and heard. So I think fundamentally that would be the first reason. The second would be to learn the skill while you're young, because just listening to Avi as well as Stacey and even Ted, it sounds as though there has to be experience that's gained over some time. And I think sometimes the sooner you get into the space of learning, the more your skill set grows and the more value you can be to these organizations and these boards. Because sometimes experience is all that you can have, because as Abby was mentioning, in that you will only know how to handle a crisis because sometimes you have to have gone through the crisis to develop the skill set to be able to know and understand how exactly to be able to work past these things. And also, in order to sit as a chairperson, you'd have to come with a considerable amount of experience sometimes. And so really it's getting your foot into the door, getting your journey started so that you can build your skill set, and thirdly rather, to ensure that you can make sure that some of the issues that are youth-based can have a voice as well as representation. I hope that answers your question.
It does, it does. And Ted, I wasn't sure if you had anything to add to that, having started your own company at quite a young age. What for you has been the role that young people play in this space?
Yeah, I think it's also in general it's a really good learning journey. And then when you first started it and get involved in these spaces, it's more on the learning side than the contributing side. So you learn the structures, you learn how to call for board meetings and all that kind of stuff, the legal matters, the structure matters. And as we as we grow, become much more later stages, that's when we start to add into people who are reputable into the board. So that's, again, you started to learn from them and see how they handle situation. Crisis, when there's a crisis, it's not that you have to have the answer, but it's a collective decision through the board. So you get to learn from that. And when you are more familiar with this, now that when I'm participating more on the board side related to the public policy side, that's when I can really sit in and see what can I contribute, with all these things that I've learned over the years. So I really think it's more of a process. The earlier you get involved, the quicker you start learning, because it's very hard for young people to get involved and first day right away they can contribute. It doesn't really work that way. There's a learning journey to be go through.
Nicole, I was just going to jump in if I could and say one of the quotes from somebody who I've spoken to a number of times. She said, I just wish I had done this 10 years ago because I'm loving it and I'm just being able to, really make a difference. So that was her advice, was to jump in.
I agree with that. And Avi, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I actually wanted to just respond to what Stacey said earlier, but I think your question to Mavis led on to it. But just to add, I don't think anything can prepare you, or there's a specific set of skills. Like Stacey mentioned, there's quite a variety of skills depending on the board, depending on the organization, the skill sets. In general, there's quite a few set of skills which are required, but specific to the role that you play, that might vary. But as a young engineer, I think the important thing is to put your hand up and say, I would like to make a difference. I would like to contribute. It doesn't have to be a big corporate. It can be your neighborhood. I think Stacey mentioned it earlier. It can be a neighborhood community or school or church where you volunteer, be a part of that committee. They might not be called a board. They go by different names. So you participate in the committee. How do we improve the welfare of the community or the members? And that will start bringing those skills in. You start interacting with people. There will be other individuals who are much grayer or white-haired, and they can teach you a lot. You will learn things very quickly. And like Ted said, the first 6 months or a year, you're not going to you might not add a lot of value, but don't worry about it. All the board members who are there have been through the same thing. So there's no stupid question or stupid suggestion. They're always looking for new and creative ways of, progressing the organization. So just put it out there. You'll be forgiven, and it's always a learning curve. So just enjoy it and see what you can do to make it better.
Exactly right. And I think there's something to be said about the opportunities that young people get, and learning from the more experienced, but also the other side where the younger generation is growing up in such a different time to those with 20, 30, 40 years experience. And we can't underestimate the value that that age or youth can bring to those conversations. So I just wanted to take a moment, just if anyone does have any questions. I've seen one post in the chat, but we've got them in the Google Drive or Google spreadsheet. So if you do have any questions, please post them through. I will ask the first one now because it does actually, I guess, link into what we've just been discussing. So thank you. Apologize if I pronounced the name wrong, but Sibo from South Africa has just asked, how soon should young engineers get involved in boards? And I guess I'll add to that question by asking, how soon should they get involved in boards, and why in particular should young engineers get involved in boards? So I think first I'll go to you, Stacey.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. I was really keen to be nominated to answer this. So you know I'm obviously a big advocate of diversity across all aspects. So having that young representation at any time is fabulous, but particularly Y engineers. So this is something I've done a bit of presenting on in terms of engineers on boards, and I'm quite particular about encouraging this because we as engineers, we have, and so it's scientifically proven, there are studies out there that share this insight, but we are collaborative. We are the fourth most trustworthy profession behind doctors, nurses and teachers. We have an ability, obviously, to be creative and analytical. And, you know, when you combine the ability to think details as well as strategic, and there's a lot of organisations who have responsibilities with physical assets. So they may have property or buildings. They may have IT systems. So physical assets, which engineers, you know, we have an understanding of how those parts of the world work. But also we have that systems thinking. So we know how to be able to pull different things together. So when we talk about systems like organisational structures and governance, which has various components to it, which when all put together is the glue, I call it the glue of what makes a good company, so, or organisation. So it's how our minds think. And there are not a whole lot of engineers on boards. There's a stat which from a couple of years ago of a study here in Australia that less than 3% of directors on boards in the company space were actually from a STEM background. So if you translate that to engineers, that means there's even fewer engineers. So imagine if you had a lot more of us in the boardroom, then what kind of difference could we make to decision making, especially when we come from a science-based, evidence-based and information-based basis for our decision making in a nutshell.
Avi, thanks, Stacey. From Avi, from your experience, what benefit do you see that young engineers can bring to boards, having worked with them yourself?
I think young members bring a complete different perspective. In Stacey's case, previously, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't a part of the constitution that, or Stacey's constitution, that they have to be a young member on the various technical divisions and committees. And when they were busy reviewing the constitution, that's something that we pushed for, is to include it, that there is some sort of representation at a board level and at each of the technical divisions and committees. So that helps because, especially with technology, I think young engineers are more tech savvy. They are into 4IR and AI and VR and all those latest terms. And I think that changes how we do business. That changes how we serve our members. And in Stacey's case, I think most of our members are under 35s, most of those 11,000 members. So it's important to understand, really understand what are the issues and challenges that they face. And that has to be communicated to how the organization is run. So it's essential that young people are involved.
Agreed. And thank you to people that are asking questions. I will ask the committee one more question and then jump into the audience questions. So when you first join a board, what I guess are the key expectations that you should have around your responsibilities? We've spoken about there's a very broad range of boards, but I guess by saying, yes, I want to be a board member, what are the key things that you would be responsible for? And I'll head to Mavis first.
Thank you for the question, Nicole. Interesting that you'd ask me this question because I remember one of my experiences, and I think this is a beautiful place to be authentic and quite open as to some of our experiences. And as a civil engineer that comes with sort of a development background, accounting is just one of those things that's not exactly my forte. I'm good with math, but not accounting, two different things. And so I had this experience where we had to read the budget report as well as sort of the report back from the accountant. And they were talking about qualified and unqualified audit reports. And I was like, okay, this is an interesting terminology. They didn't teach us this in statistics and structural analysis, you know. But nonetheless, so jokes aside, it's just one of those things where you need to understand that when you get your board pack, and a board pack is this sort of thick document that you receive before the board. Primarily, it's usually about 7 working days before the time. And it's a document that you're supposed to peruse through. And this is what's going to inform the entire board meeting. So when the executive board actually speaks, sort of reports back to the board, it's from this document. And a lot of that information inside this board pack is what you're supposed to go through so as to prepare you for the meeting. So I think the expectation is that firstly, you're supposed to go through this board pack simply because the board meeting is not an opportunity for you to read through it. It's for you to actually give constructive criticism as well as constructive sort of strategic input. And so the expectations are that you will help this organization achieve its objectives, whether profit or not for profit, and whatever its core values as well as propositions are. And this means that you have an obligation to make sure that it is actually complying to some of the governance frameworks that surround this board. So legal obligations, strategic obligations, decision-making obligations. And it's a very, very large responsibility to carry because you as a board simply actually are at the forefront of leading this organization to its success or its failure. So I think if anything, how you would actually put yourself in a position to prepare yourself is really just by equipping yourself with the necessary information, understanding, and then being able to feed back what you think in as far as the core way forward is.
Thank you very much, Mavis. And I'll jump into the audience questions now. So thank you for those that are sending them through. There's a few coming through. So firstly, I wanted to go to Tina, who's asked, can you please touch on diversity in the boardroom and why does diversity matter in this space, not just on skill sets in general? So I might head to Stacey first off with that one, if you can touch on that, please.
So I think, as I mentioned before, that diversity, yes, is in terms of skills. So yes, you're able to understand some of these things that Mavis just alluded to, but also you might have some insight. So you as a young person, you know what it's like to be perhaps in your 20s, perhaps maybe not long having finished uni, perhaps you're a graduate now and you're experiencing certain things in the workplace, or out in society, or you've got particular perceptions about the world that others can obviously tap into. So that diversity in my view is a whole range of things. Yes, it's gender, yes, it's age, but there's also family circumstances, that can be quite different, that can give you different insights. We're talking engineers, to me, I call it technical diversity because, or professional diversity. So you're bringing obviously those different skill sets. But there's also, people with disabilities who have different insights from their experiences. So it's an experience-based insight, which is what is a component of diversity alongside skill sets. So I think there's a whole range of things that you can apply that to when you start thinking about it. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Stacey. It is important to, I guess, recognise the different types of diversity. And I know within the engineering space, as a structural engineer myself, there are many a times where I'm the only female in the room. And sometimes I'm the only female in the room or just the only person under 40. And so understanding that diversity comes from the skill sets, yes, but it also comes from the experience. And it might not just simply be as how you identify yourself, but what you've experienced to get to where you are. So something that I know that I'm quite passionate about is when I put together panel discussions or when I work with people, you do want to make sure that you do get a range of viewpoints, and it's not a tick box exercise as much as I guess that's one way to look at it. it's more than that. It's about making sure that the conversations are equally informed, the conversations have a diverse range of insights, and you genuinely get a better discussion and better outcomes when you actually apply that diversity in all aspects, whether it's a single project, whether it's a board, or whether it's just a simple discussion. And the more diverse viewpoints that you can get, the more productive and innovative you'll be. We have another question, and I think it's coming from, oh, I've clicked on the wrong thing, that one. From Wilhelm, who is, being a civil engineer with an MBA, I feel equipped to sit on a board. However, there seems to be a lot of controversy around how board members are appointed in my country, and she's named that as Namibia. So Mavis, you might be able to answer this one. And how do I go about it? So if there is, you feel comfortable in applying for boards, but the external world may not be ready or open for you, some techniques that you can adopt?
So one of the things that my mentor always says to me is that opportunity meets preparation. So in essence, for finding yourself in a position that already has established that you are registered on a board, I think that's a fundamental step that you've already taken, in that the decision has been made. Now you need to step into that, and that's the preparation element that actually has to take place. I understand when you speak about controversy and as far as what happens in appointing board members, but I think there's so many diverse organizations that exist in any given space, whether it be Namibia, South Africa, Australia, or even Singapore. And at the end of the day, it's really just getting yourself into a position where you're comfortable enough to start applying, and not really looking at all the reasons as to why you will not be able to get into the position, and look at all the reasons as to why you could get into the position. And I think that's the preparation that I'm really talking about, in that make the decision and then step into actually preparing yourself to meet the opportunity by actually filling out the applications, networking, and getting yourself into the rooms with some of these people who sit on boards, and speak to them, ask them, how exactly did you get yourself into this position? Let the interest that has sparked within you also be understood by your surrounding and your network. So I think, if anything, congratulations on already establishing that you'd like to sit on a board. I think that's the biggest step, because that mental preparation is also such a sort of thing, something that you have to work past, because oftentimes what stops us from actually getting into the position is that we don't see or deem ourselves worthy or fit to sit in the board. But because you've established that already, that's a big step. And now my only encouragement to you is to actually start applying and getting yourself into the rooms with the people that you could discuss this with, because networking is also a fundamental part of opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mavis. Ted, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just one point, because as I was part of my daily work working with the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, one of the things that we value opinion is definitely from people, youth on the grassroots in different cities and different countries. So your frustrations in your cities, your countries, could be precisely the reason why some international organization or committees will want you to be sitting in the board, to contribute those real on the ground experience. So I think the opportunity is everywhere. There's many international organizations and committing forming. So yeah, just keep looking, keep applying. I believe, there's definitely a chance for you to try those.
Thank you so much, Ted. So just being conscious that we have about 5 minutes left. And if anyone does have any last minute questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. And if we don't get to them now, I'll make sure we populate responses to that document after the session. But I did want to, I guess, ask one question for all the panelists to respond to. And we've sort of started talking about that thanks to William's question. But if there's people on this call today or people watching that are interested in joining a board, what is it, one piece of advice that you would share with them today? One piece of advice, it may be around how to start, what to look for, what skills to develop, just what would be one piece of advice? So I might start with you, Stacey.
Thanks, Nicole. My answer to that question is probably going to be a really obvious one, and it's to say go to my website. So boardpresence.com.au. I actually wrote a book which I released mid last year in the middle of COVID, and it was distinctly with the purpose of giving information and guidance from my journey, but also a lot of instruction about how to go about applying for a position, but also that pre-work that Mavis just talked about, which is about understanding you, that preparation and getting yourself prepared to be able to apply when the opportunity arises. But I've got a couple of different bits and pieces coming up. So I have a Boards and Bubbles session, which is just an open 1 hour chit chat, ask me anything. But also, as Nicole said before, I've just released some details about going through that process. It's a 3-month program. That's not publicly available, but just shoot me your details if you're interested in understanding some more about that. But look, happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you very much, Stacey. And I have posted a link to your website just in the chat if anyone does want to note it down. So I guess moving on to yourself, Ted, what's one piece of advice that you'd like to share with the audience today?
I think similar to the point that has been mentioned, I think networking is really key, you know, to talk to people, to be familiar with all these, especially as an engineer in general, we're not so, maybe I shouldn't stereotype, but a lot of the engineers that I work with, including myself in the beginning, we're not so good at communications. I know we're not too familiar with business structures and all that kind of stuff. So the earlier you start to network, working with these people, learn how those languages works, you know, I think that will be very useful when the opportunity comes, that you will be ready for it.
And networking is such an important skill to develop. And Avi, what's one piece of advice that you'd like to share?
The main thing is don't be scared. Just put your hand up. You will learn. Don't worry, you will cope. Just be confident enough. Just put up your hand and go for it. Good luck.
Short and sweet. I like it. Don't be afraid, just go for it. And Mavis, what would be one piece of advice that you'd like to share with everyone today?
So one of the things that my mentor always says is that you have to use every stage as an interview for your next opportunity, which means that you go into life understanding that each and every single day where you come across someone, you come across a website, you come across a link to something, there is always an opportunity to use that as your interview for your next opportunity, in essence, a stage for your next opportunity, which means that finding yourself in a webinar that speaks about how to get into that position, finding yourself in a room where they're speaking about some of the matters that you hold close to your heart, it's just a question of availing yourself to find yourself in the stage so that the opportunity can meet the preparation. And I think so to really, to sum it up, it's in essence just finding yourselves in the rooms where you need to be. Take out the time to actually impart some skill sets within yourself, and don't be afraid to start with humble beginnings, because one of the things that Ted mentioned, or I think it was Avi, in that you can actually just start with any organization and build your way up, because at the end of the day, we tend to always want the big opportunities, not understanding that there's a lot of background work that has to happen for the big opportunities to actually meet you. So just do what you've got to do, start with what you've got, and just make sure that you actually get the mentorship that you need to get to where you want to go.
Thank you so much, Mavis. And we're perfectly on time, which is really good. I just wanted to extend a big thanks to all 4 speakers today. It's great to have such a diverse group. And I know personally, having the opportunity to speak with each of you before this session and during this session, I've gained so much knowledge and just excitement about the opportunities that could lie ahead in the board space for young engineers. So thank you to Stacey, Mavis, Avi and Ted for your time today. We're hearing thanks through the panel, through the chat. So I hope everyone has enjoyed the session today. This is the next edition of the Engineering the Future webinar series by the Young Engineer Future Leaders Committee. There will be more webinars coming up in the future and different ways to get involved. So please do check out the website. The link has been posted in the chat, but you can find us on the WFEO website, and as well as on LinkedIn. So thank you again to our amazing speakers for today. I hope you have all enjoyed it, and wherever you are in the world, enjoy your day, night, evening, morning, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you very much.